Right. So let me get this timer on. Well, thank you for joining today, either live or on the future. I don't have any conflict of interest to disclose, and just acknowledge that the funding that made this study possible came from the John Templeton Foundation as part of the Genetics and Human Science project. In this talk, we are going to be focusing on three questions. First, how accurate are people when estimating the heritability of alcohol dependence, schizophrenia, and depression? What predicts that someone underestimates or overestimates the heritability of a trait? And does perceiving the heritability as high or lower change someone's personal views on psychiatric genetic testing? So why do we ask these questions? Well, basically, we just want to improve the way we communicate genetics to the public. Ideally, we want the public to have a correct understanding of the research outcomes that we produce in our field, such as the heritability of mental health traits. But what we have found in other areas of science communication, especially when the scientific topic is emotionally charged, as in the case of climate change or vaccination, is that it's not a straight direction between just communicating the facts to the public and people will just take on that information, but it's been shown that we engage in a motivated way with scientific knowledge. So what does it mean to engage in a motivated way with science? Let's take, for example, the topic of this talk. We're going to be talking about people's perceptions of heritability and their attitudes towards psychiatric genetic testing, and these are examples of the things we're going to be seeing in this talk. So the classical approach would be we just provide information about the research, and we expect people to modify their views on these topics and their attitudes based on this knowledge. But what the motivated reasoning framework says is that actually there are all these underlying factors that influence the way people understand science, and it could be personal experiences, it could be their education, but it can be also like moral values, political orientation, needs, fears, worries, that altogether they will influence how they approach the topic we're talking about. So this has been seen in fields as I said, climate change and vaccination. So we want to see how these translate into psychiatric genetics, and this is the case here. For the present study on all the questions, we are going to be using this data set, which is an online survey that we conducted in Australia, the UK, and the US. The participants from Australia came from families that had already participated in genetic studies at QMR. And the participants from the UK and the US were recruited via prolific.com, which is a platform similar to MChark, and they come from the general population. So let's move on with the first question. We asked participants to estimate how strong were the genetic influence on these traits. So they could answer from 0 to 1. There is a caveat, is that the UK and the US participants had a slider that went from 0 to 100, while the participants from Australia had 5 choices, like either 0, 0.25, 0.5, 0.75, and 1, meaning like 0 and 1 the same in both cases. So in this first slide, what we have is the distribution of responses to this question in the 3 countries. The red arrow indicates the closest value to the latest meta-analysis from doing studies, which is where we are going to get our accurate estimate or the correct estimate for these traits. You can see this is alcohol dependence. There is a tendency to respond 50%. That is not due to the slider. The slider was randomly placed, and this is just people who do have a tendency to answer 50%, but there is a tendency to underestimate the heritability of alcohol dependence. In the case of depression, we see also a tendency to answer 50%, but a tendency to overestimate the heritability of depression. And finally, we have schizophrenia, where we also, in the same way as with the other traits, we see that there is a quite like a wide distribution of responses. And people do tend to estimate higher the heritability of schizophrenia, but we still see many respondents answering that the heritability of the trait is around like 50 or lower than 50%. There are other studies that have looked at this. They did ask this question a different way, and they didn't put as much focus on the motivated reasoning concept of that, but just to keep in mind that there are some people also that have looked into people's estimates of heritability, and they're actually really recent studies. So it looks like there is like more interest in learning about the public perceptions of psychiatric genetics recently, which is really good. And that takes us to the second question. So using the estimates that people made in this first study, we categorize them in either overestimates, accurate estimates, or underestimates. And the reason for that is that there may be different motivational processes underlying overestimating or underestimating the heritability of the trait. Basically, what we conducted was a multinomial logic model, which is, well, it's just like two logistic regressions applied at the same time. And we're going to compare the likelihood of responding in an accurate way or overestimating, or accurate way versus underestimating the heritability. This is just a list of the predictors that we included based on a literature review on motivated reasoning, variables that have been associated either with understanding of science in other fields that where the topic is emotionally charged, or variables that have been associated to perception of genetics or genetic deterministic thinking. So for the first results, we have the comparison between either underestimate the heritability of the traits or correctly estimate the heritability of those traits. We see that all the significant results, they're actually factors that make people less likely to underestimate the heritability of the three traits. Like, for example, women, they are less likely to underestimate the heritability of all these three traits. As a common sense result that we would expect is that believing in biological determinism, or like believing that human characteristics are, including personality and behavior, they're like rooted in biology. That also makes less likely to underestimate the heritability of these traits. On the other side, we have what could make someone, or the association between overestimating or correctly estimating the heritability of traits. It's actually interesting that most of the factors that are significantly associated with overestimating, it's interesting to see that we found mainly factors that are associated with overestimating, but less with not overestimating genetic influence on traits. We see what something we could expect is that basic genetic literacy makes it less likely to overestimate the heritability of alcohol dependence, although we don't see that for schizophrenia and depression. And just reminding everyone that this is basic genetic literacy, is not genetic literacy specifically targeting polygenic traits or mental health traits. And level of education is the other variable that makes less likely to overestimate the heritability of schizophrenia. But we don't see many variables that are associated with not overestimating the heritability, which can indicate that there is an issue, but there is maybe a trend towards overestimating genetic influence on traits. But we can talk more about that in the discussion. And just like saying that there are other variables that we tested and we didn't find any association, like moral foundations, political values, or tolerance for uncertainty, which have been found in other areas, but not in the present study. And finally, for the last question, what we were looking at is how people's perceptions, people's estimates of heritability would change the response to these questions that are agree or disagree responses for each one of the three traits. So I will let you have a quick look to this question, although we are actually gonna be seeing them now with the graphs. method. In the same way, we would run a logistic regression where we corrected for age, gender, and level of education, and we were correcting for country and family in all the analyses. So in the way that these graphs are constructed, you have even if the estimate of the heritability was analyzed as a continuous measure, for the sake of explanation, I have grouped the responses in 5 categories. So from left to right, you will see that underneath the columns, you see like a 0 to 12.5, 12.5 to 37.5. So that's just a group people's estimates that lie in that range. The star means what's the closest value to the point estimate from the meta-analysis, from the twin studies meta-analysis. And this is how the response to this question, the one that you see in the title, changes based on the heritability that people estimated. So in the case of able to cope, there are not much difference between categories. In the case of wanting to know only if there is something I can do, we did see a significant effect of estimated heritability and alcohol dependence. So in the case of alcohol dependence, the higher you estimate the heritability, the more likely you are to agree with this statement. And also, I indicated this by highlighting the odds ratio underneath, like at the bottom. So you see the highlight, that's what it means. For the next one, I would want to have children if I knew I had a high genetic predisposition for these traits. We did find an effect of perceived heritability in the case of depression and schizophrenia. And also keep in mind that the stars, even if this is telling us how people think when they estimate closer to the correct value of heritability, or what we could agree is like the correct value of heritability for that trait. And also, spoiler alert, we did correct for genetic literacy after this analysis, and it didn't change any of the associations that we found. So the next question would be, I would choose a partner that had a high genetic predisposition for these traits, and we found a significant impact of the perceived heritability in the case of depression and schizophrenia. Next one, the question was, will help me be a better parent to know the genetic predisposition of my kids, sorry. We define an influence of perceived heritability on all the traits. Next one is about concerns of getting health or life insurance, and we did as well find the higher heritability associated with more worried about this statement. And finally, this is tapping on people's perceptions of how malleable or how much lifestyle could compensate the predisposition. We did see an influence, a linear effect in schizophrenia, although if you see there is this inverted U shape in all the traits, which is interesting regarding about people that don't think that there is a genetic influence. When they are asked about this, they are maybe like more prone to say, oh, I don't think there's genetic influence, but if I had a high genetic influence, I think it would be less likely for me to compensate based on my lifestyle.
José, sorry to interrupt, but can you try to wrap up, please?
Yes, yeah. So as I said, sorry, I almost wrong, sorry. So yes, as I said, that doesn't change based on genetic literacy. And well, given that I already spent too much time with this, I will just skim through the conclusions, but I hope that if there is something that wasn't clear, I can definitely ask that in person or by chat. Happy to do that. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you, José. I will start with a question. So really interesting. I think it's really important work. I mean, we all do genetic studies, but the question is, how do we communicate our findings to the public and how do they interpret that? I think it's a very important question. So really great research.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm just like, when I look at your results, I'm a bit like you find factors for under or overestimating heritability. And I'm a bit like, so what will be the end goal of your research? So is that people have a good impression of heritability, or do you want also that they understand what to do with this information?
So the idea behind this kind of research is we want people to have understanding of genetics that is as close as possible to the understanding that we have in the field. And then by finding factors that kind of like could bias the perception of genetics or could be hindering the understanding of genetics, we can target those factors. Like if we know that people with a family history have this tendency to overestimate the genetic factors, maybe that's a worry that we can tackle when we talk about genetics. Or maybe we know that if we think that people that, if it's, for example, this is also a question of does genetic literacy influence at this point the responses they have? Is just a question of improving genetic literacy, or we have to introduce genetic literacy in a way? Sorry, because what we didn't find, for instance, like influence of moral values or political ideology, which was found in climate change science, is you try to see if you have to market or you have to tackle specific values at the same time that you talk that could get in the way of the science, if that makes sense. Because people values may think, oh, I feel controlled by scientists when they talk about this genetic test. And that makes a worry that you have to be addressing when you talk about genetics to the public.
Yeah. I think I could I have a lot of questions still, but we can discuss them later because we are running a little bit late. But thank you, José.